So we began. Now today is going to be a little bit short in terms of what we're covering because we're only covering 2 practices today. So we're actually continuing on with the loving kindness that we worked on last week because we're doing 3 days of each of these, and that's part of the reason why there are not as many practices to do. We just do them for a longer period of time. And so this will be a little bit short because we only have the 2 topics to cover here. So for the 65th and 67th days, we're looking at boundless compassion. So we did the equanimity, we did the loving kindness, and so now boundless compassion. So this is the wish that other beings be separate from suffering, so that they don't suffer. And of course, the word suffering is perhaps not the best translation of dukkha, but more of a dissatisfaction, those kind of things, discontent. So there's a variety of words that are actually better translations of what was intended by the Buddha here. And doing this for all sentient beings, because this comes in the practices of the Bodhisattva. So anything that we do for the benefit of all sentient beings. So we're wishing them to be free from that discontent, dissatisfaction, or suffering. And so the Buddhist Sutra emphasizes that we should not practice too many kinds of practices to attain nirvana. Although in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that seems to be what we do. Apparently in India, they were much more focused and tried to really, really be good at a particular practice, whereas in Tibet, there was much more of a tendency to want to get lots of different practices. I don't think that's necessarily bad in and of itself. There's a lot to be said for really learning a practice in depth. But when you do multiple practices, the other benefit that comes from that is you begin to see that every practice is quite similar to every other practice. And every deity is quite similar to every other deity. And there's a kind of a connection and a pattern that begins to evolve as we begin to learn these things. So in cases like, for example, Garchen Rinpoche once said, well, if you've received the empowerment for one deity, you've received them for all, because they're all the same. So the Dharmakaya for one's exactly the same as the Dharmakaya for any other one. So there really is no difference between these. So the idea is that here, though, is that we not do lots and lots of different practices. Here Rinpoche says practice just one religion, and so it's fairly broad in that context. And here he also says the religion is the practice of compassion, and that's very similar to what His Holiness the Dalai Lama often says. He said, my religion is compassion. Although sometimes he uses different words like loving kindness and so forth. So when we have compassion, then we also have the teachings of the Buddha and omniscience. So Rongzab Choki Zangpo said that if you are a Buddhist practitioner, it is fine if you don't have many different kinds of practices, but there are 2 things you do need, and those are wisdom and compassion. So oftentimes enlightenment is actually described as the merging together of compassion and wisdom. So those are the 2 things that are very important as a part of that. Can't have one without the other. So compassion is really the root of the Mahayana teachings and doctrines. So you should practice that all of the time with strong effort. So that's kind of the heart of the teachings, is the things related to the 4 immeasurables of the 4 boundless phenomena and other similar kinds of practice within the Mahayana tradition. So compassion arises from understanding other beings' suffering. So it's all about relationship. If there are no other beings, there's no reason for compassion, right? So it's about relationships with others. Therefore, when you see information from the internet about human suffering, animal suffering, and so on, You should not leave only looking at them as some kind of a scene. So if you don't like what you're seeing, that's understandable. That's a sign of compassion, actually. When you see that, you see one animal killing another animal, for example, that's a sign of the compassion that you have of not wanting to watch that. But he goes on to point out here that you should focus on the degree of their suffering. If you focus on their suffering with understanding, sometimes compassion will naturally arise in your mind. If you have the instructions of the great vehicle, compassion will arise even more strongly. So we use those kinds of experiences to develop that compassion, to emphasize that compassion as a part of our way of seeing things. Then he gives an example. When you meditate on the sufferings of the hell realms and so on, you should not think only of the suffering of the external objects, the things that are causing the suffering there. It is not enough to just wish that all beings have happiness and be free from suffering, or that you will make those beings be happy and free from suffering. This kind of mind is that of having a superior attitude. Okay, so if all you're thinking about is, I want to make these people free of suffering, that can be, I wouldn't say it necessarily is, but it can be kind of your own arrogance about that kind of thing. So we need to be a little bit careful about that. Well, what's the difference? He goes on in the next sentence to say, rather, we should say prayers with the wish that all beings attain happiness and be separated from the suffering of the hell realms and so on. So this creates a deeper level of aspiration and action. And I think that's what he's getting at here in terms of the approach of doing it through saying prayers. If we see that, we can think about wanting to help all beings attain enlightenment. That's the Buddhadharma vow, after all. But we can also then emphasize that by doing that through the process of saying prayers. And then he goes on, similarly, at all times you should practice with your own hands as much as you can. For example, each week, month, year, do all you can to rescue thousands of fish or crabs that will otherwise be killed, or 500 or 100 or even a few, as many as you can. We were talking about that in a class this morning, because here in Arizona, it's a little dry. We don't have a lot of crabs. We don't have a lot of fish and so forth. And we're talking about freeing live animals here. So when we do get fish here, that's very rare that they're actually in live form. Occasionally, perhaps, but very rare. And even then, if you got them, where would you put them? How would you free them? We don't have places to do that very much either. Animals, one of the examples of an animal came up when talking about the wild horses. Well, you could buy a wild horse, but what are you going to do with the wild horse? And so forth. So we don't have quite as many of the examples that are being given here in the text, but we can still do things like, instead of killing insects that are in our house, we can capture them, set them free, some of those kind of things that we can do. And then he goes on, similarly, if you can help by giving medicine to sick people, even just one person, or you can give a good breakfast to someone who has no food to eat, you can practice compassion with your hands and try your best in as many ways as you can. So it doesn't all have to be about freeing animals that have been captured in one way or another for food. There are other kinds of things that we can do to benefit beings, human beings, and other kinds of beings as well. And so we do the things that we can as a part of that when the opportunities arise. One of the important things for me about that is to look for opportunities to do that. Now, if you're not intentionally looking for those opportunities, you're not going to see nearly as many. But if you are intentionally looking for those opportunities to help other beings in one way or another, you're going to start finding more of those. They will start arising just because of your mindfulness with respect to that particular experience for those beings. And so then he refers to the words of my perfect teacher, which gives many examples of compassion practices, and that starts on page 201. And so he says, well, I'm not going to talk about that, but I will give some brief key points here. So there's a list in his teaching. First one is, compassion means wishing other beings to be free from suffering. The second one is to focus on all sentient beings. So it's not just particular ones we like and not the ones we don't like, it's all sentient beings. The cause of compassion is to understand that all beings have been your mother and remember their kindness, and so on. Understand others' suffering, or understand the great vehicles teachers are holding you in their heart. Number 4, the method of practicing compassion is to see yourself in all sentient beings as like your own mother, or when you take the Bodhisattva vows, think of all sentient beings as your only son. So in either case, we're trying to use those as examples to be more compassionate toward others. Number 5, the action is to practice compassion as much as you can to match your ability. And the next one, in 6, is to develop compassion. Follow a great teacher, read Mahayana texts, and always surround yourself with people who also have compassion. Number 7, the sign of achieving compassionate mind is that you arouse compassion for all sentient beings from the depth of your heart, not only talking about it. So it's intention, but it's also doing. Number 8, the benefit of having compassion is inconceivable. It will make the mind stable while increasing bodhicitta mind. Naturally, that encompasses all the Buddhadharma, which purifies obscuration, strongly leading to many other accomplishments. And so these things are interdependent. And we do one thing, it affects something else. And so when we do these practices, one practice benefits another practice, and that practice benefits another practice. And so they all work together to help us. So we don't need to do a lot of practices, but when we do more than one practice, we get multiple benefits from those because they work collectively together. Continuing on then in the next paragraph, the quiescence of Buddhadharma is rooted in love and compassion. As we said, that's really the heart. The foundation of good karmic fortune is also paved with compassion. So karma is about ethics, but when we have that compassion, that creates actions that result in good karma. Eventually, at the time of realizing complete perfection or complete enlightenment, the continuous enjoyment of richness of being, the Sambhogakaya, and the stratum of physical emanation, the Nirmanakaya, are also rooted in love and compassion. So the kayas of the Buddhas, particularly the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya forms, are really rooted in that sense of compassion being expressed to help all beings. So we must therefore always consider compassion as not only the root foundation, a fountain of all practices, but the most important of all practices. So for this one, for 3 days, contemplate on compassion for all sentient beings, and after that, we rest our mind and dedicate the prayer as before, or do the dedication prayer as before. So part of this is about learning to do things as a Buddha. You can visualize, just like when we do deity practice, we visualize ourselves as a Buddha already. And so part of this is about becoming compassionate as if we already are a Buddha, and being loving, having loving kindness as if we are already a Buddha. We need to begin embodying these practices. As I often say, it's not about being a great meditator. It's about using that as practice for the rest of your life. And so we apply these principles then when we get up off of the cushion to everything else that we do throughout the day. Moving on then, we do the Boundless Compassion for 3 days, and then we move on to this next one, which is Boundless Sympathetic Joy. And this is in the words of my perfect teacher, starting on page 213. So we also do this one for 3 days. So the 68th through the 70th day, we work on this one. So for those days, contemplate boundless sympathetic joy. This joy means you don't have jealousy and can cherish being joyful toward another's wealth, family, boyfriend or girlfriend, higher status, riches and honor, knowledge, and so forth, even those having an equal or higher state than you. This sympathetic joy is a special antidote for jealousy. Okay, so that's a key part of this. Jealousy generates many strong negative emotions, such as anger. When you're angry towards someone, it may arouse even stronger feelings, generating hatred. A different level of anger, basically. Excuse me. Jealousy can arise even when you don't have any reason for that. But when you feel joy toward another, jealousy cannot arise. So from that one state, it acts as a block to the other. When other people feel sorry for you when you are angry, your anger may diminish. But jealousy will not be reduced by others feeling sorry for you. Therefore, you should abandon your great enemy of malicious jealousy through the practice of cherishing joy. Another point, if you receive the Bodhisattva vows, you should also practice cherishing joy. For example, when a mother has many kids, she needs to work hard to feed all those kids. But after some time, the kids grow up and can feed themselves. Then the mother should be happy for the release of that burden from her shoulders and should not be jealous toward her children. Similarly, when you receive the Bodhisattva vows, you promise all the Buddhas that you will take care of all sentient beings like they are your own child. You have responsibilities to make all beings be happy now and in the future, forever. So, for now, if someone gets wealth, name, recognition, and other joyful things, you should feel joyful and not jealous. Okay, that can be a challenge sometimes for us, but when we look at it from this perspective, then we can kind of back away from the jealousy. You may think, well, they got it for reasons that were not appropriate or something like that without actually being jealous. And technically that would not be a violation of this, but you have to be careful with that because that can become a rationalization and it can be a form of jealousy that you're just not visualizing or feeling at that particular time. When Buddha Shakyamuni was young, his name was Shonu Dungdrup, and one day Lei Shen shot a white duck with an arrow, and the duck fell out of the sky into the garden. Shonu Dungdrup held the white duck and took out the arrow. When Lei Shen came to claim the duck and asked Shonu Dungdrup to give him the duck, Shonu Dungdrup said, "This duck is mine." Then again, Lei Shen argued with him and said, "This duck is mine." Shonu Dungdrup answered, "When did you become the owner of this duck?" Lei Shen replied, "Actually, this duck is a wild animal, so it is ownerless. And when I saw it first and shot my arrow at the duck, this duck became mine." Then Shonu Dungdrup said, "Oh ho, this duck is mine because many kalpas of time before I held this duck as my own child and I practiced a lot of difficult Bodhisattva doctrines for this duck." Lei Shen became speechless. Similarly, when we took the Bodhisattva vows in front of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, we vowed to hold all sentient beings like our own child. So now that some of your children are having joyful experiences, you should not cherish it and never be jealous of them. Personally, I find that example to be a little bit abstract. I don't see a lot of parents being jealous of their children for their accomplishments. In fact, in many ways, it's kind of the opposite of that. They're very proud of what their children accomplish, if you will. So we may not have direct experience of that particular example, but it helps illustrate the principle. When you practice cherishing joy, contemplate on others feeling joyful, especially when you feel jealousy toward others. And again, that's the key, is the jealousy here. So it's almost like the joyful, sympathetic joy is an antidote to jealousy. You can look at it that way. So when you feel jealousy toward others, you need to contemplate that. you should focus on generating joy for that. If it is difficult to arouse cherishing joy in your mind, you should remember that person as your own previous mother in many lifetimes and her inconceivable kindness toward you. Now again, we've talked about this before, that sometimes we have experiences with mothers that are not exactly the way that's being described in these texts, but you just have to imagine that at some point you had mothers that were that way and had that kind of loving kindness and compassion for you. If you feel jealousy toward another's Dharma knowledge and practices, you should contemplate that person having wisdom eyes, like an authentic teacher, and contemplate yourself as having much lower status than he or she, as in Jojai Dipamkara Sri Jana's instruction, the one that we had in Boundless Love. So the previous section, you can go back and review that. Think of everybody as better than you forever. Decide that you will never feel unhappy for that. Give rise to a happy mind for them, the sign of perfecting the practice of joy. Practice joy and make it into your own experiences like we've been discussing here. When you conclude, do the dedication prayers and so forth as before. So with this, we have completed the meditation instructions on the 4 boundless qualities. And these can be summarized as have a kind heart. And the Dalai Lama frequently talks about that kind of thing. Having a good heart is the phrase that he usually uses as a part of this. So if you have a good heart, then you're practicing these 4 one way or another. So those are the 2 practices for this next week, and continuing on the one on love that we're also extending into this week as well.